And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Monday, August 8th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories right here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com, so rush over there and hear some of the news from the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. 2 Navajo chapters in New Mexico are joining the modern age. The infrastructure is in place in the Nagazi and Herfano chapters that will provide phone and internet services to 1,500 people in Navajo Housing Authority communities. The Farmington Daily Times reports that Sacred Wind Communication is using a combination of all available technology to link the most remote homes on the 27,000 square mile reservation into the digital communications network. Sacred Wind Chief Operating Officer John Landstrom says the company is using cable, fiber, radio to provide phone and internet services to some or all part of 22 Navajo chapters. Landstrom says an estimated 94% of American households have basic communication services. On the Navajo Nation, fewer than 30% can make phone calls from their own home. The long battle to gain federal recognition of 6 Indian tribes in Virginia is moving forward. The Senate Committee on Indian Affairs approved the legislation during late July, according to Virginia's U.S. Senators, Democrats Jim Webb and Mark Warner. They said the committee approvals is the final stop before a final Senate vote on the Federal Recognition Act. The 6 tribes have had state recognition for nearly 3 decades. Representative Jim Moran has introduced companion legislation in the U.S. House. Webb and Warner say the federal recognition has strong bipartisan support in Virginia, including Governor Bob McDonnell. And today we're going to talk with Shoshone Bannock correspondent Mark Trahant about the recent debt ceiling legislation debate that tired the whole nation, perhaps the world, and the warning that this may just be the beginning of the budget cuts for Indian Country and other programs we savor as Americans. Welcome to the Native News Update, Mark Trahant. We're talking to you from Fort Hall, Idaho, and we want to talk to you a little bit about discussions we've had in the past about solving the issue of lifting the debt ceiling, budget issues, legislation. Last week, the Congress, the Senate, the President came to an agreement, and the day after they signed off legislation raising the limit on the deficit, the bond rating and the rating for the credit rating of the United States went down by 1 notch. Tell me a little bit about what your perspective is about all this going on.
Well, let me start with the one little tiny bit of good news before I get really, really gloomy.
I like that.
In the Budget Control Act, which is the deficit deal, they basically have a cap of negative 2% on the IHS budget. So like other Medicare providers, they won't be able to cut more than 2% out of the IHS budget.
And why is that? How did that, was there a certain category of spending that applied to, or just Indian Health Service stuff?
It applied to all Medicare providers because they're going to be cutting in the what they call, sorry about that, in the sequestering, they're going to cut Medicare providers. And so they went down and put a list together of those that they did not want to cut. And IHS got included in that. So that's pretty good. I mean, that 2% in an underfunded agency is awful, but it could be a whole lot worse. And that I can lead to the other agencies.
Okay. My question would be this. Is that a cap that is institutionalized? Because my understanding is this agreement on raising the debt ceiling establishes a super committee that's going to sit down and go after all kinds of things. So have we been saved for a little while, or is that something perpetual throughout this process?
No, the committee could mess that up too. And I do want to talk about that. That's basically if they have to go to no agreement or sequestering, and then they'll have a formula for what programs get cut, including substantial defense cuts. That said, and I'm calling in my column this week, the super committee, the committee to cut the hell out of the federal budget.
Yeah. Very appropriate.
We have this really unfortunate mindset, in my view, that we have a short-term problem and a long-term problem. Short-term, we need to create jobs, and we need to create jobs as fast as possible because we're very quickly approaching what Japan called the last decade, where an entire decade of economic development just disappeared. And today, with the stock market losing 600 points, we're definitely close to that, where all the traction for an entire generation could be lost. Now, long term, we do have a problem, and that's where they should be focusing their efforts on the deficit. It's not short term, but the long term is simply demographics, is that we have an aging society. And it's true throughout the world. It's not Mr. Obama's problem. It's not something that the Congress has foisted on us. It's simply we live longer and there are more of us. And somehow that's been lost in this whole debacle, I think.
Is it because we have people forcing the agenda who haven't been in office for more than a year? Let's just put it out there. It's a Tea Party GOP proclaiming victory that they forced almost the collapse of the government, almost the destruction of the government to save it. We might have to destroy the government to save the government kind of philosophy, pushing the Republican. Even pushing Republican conservatives to the right in order to get a deal on this thing. Not well thought out. Does it create jobs?
No, it does. In fact, the Economic Policy Institute estimates this budget deal will cost 1.8 million jobs between now and the end of 2012. And that's in an environment already losing jobs. On top of that, and I use the metaphor in my column, the late historian Barbara Tuchman talked about the March of Folly, where governments do things that they know are not in their self-interest, but do it anyway. And this is a classic. It's not in our self-interest to be destroying jobs on this scale.
Where do the jobs come from? How do we get those jobs in relationship to what's going on if all we're facing is reductions in programs? And I know that there's some tribal people huddling today trying to figure out how to save their budget as this committee begins slicing. We've already seen budget cuts already in some of the other legislation that came through. We're expecting to see more. We're going to have less jobs. General Electric isn't going to pay any more taxes than ever before, and the top 10% or 5% who own 90% of the economy, at least at this moment, are saved from tax increases. They may get it on the expiration of the Bush thing. Where are we going with this whole issue?
Well, I'll go out on a limb, and let me preface by saying I really hope I'm wrong, but I could see entire government programs like housing, maybe programs at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Other than IHS, I think every program is at risk of disappearing, not just being cut, but disappearing. I think schools like Haskell throughout the BIE is going to be facing tremendous pressure. I mean, and you look at a school like Haskell, and it's already on the edge. And to have its budget cut 50 or 60%, at some point, budget policymakers are going to say, why do we keep this school open?
Is it similar? I was talking to someone in my travels here the last week that said basically all these little rural communities, and not real rural, but let's say middle rural, that are subsidized to keep their airports open. That's done and over with. We're going to have all the small airports, trunk airports shutting down during the winter. People aren't going to be able to go places because they can't fly out of certain places and weather and stuff like that. Those are the kinds of things you're talking about, not just where there's some realignment of monies, reorganization, slimming down. It's done and over with.
Yeah, I think a wholesale restructuring of government. And I think that's what they want. They have a very simplistic view of the world. And the idea that the government would not be involved in these things, meaning nobody's involved with them, is certainly acceptable to their way of thinking. I think right now, with interest rates low, we have an extraordinary opportunity to invest in infrastructure, put people back to work, fixing bridges, fixing roads, all the things we talked about in the last recession. But we're definitely going into another recession the way the stock market's reacting. And it's a global one. It's not just the United States. So it's not our policies that are doing this, but I think the policies from Congress are exacerbating it.
So you're saying that it could be the U.S. lost face on this, didn't it? Didn't the whole world kind of look at it and say, what the heck is this all about?
Right. And it was partly because of governance and refusing to raise taxes. I mean, it wasn't just because our debt's high. Our debt is manageable. It's a very small percentage of GDP. One example of that, and I talked about Japan and its lost decade, is if you break out the U.S. debt, it's about $35,000 per person. In Japan, about $75,000 per person, so more than double. So in a global sense, we're not that unusual, but we're just a bigger player.
Well, what's the next step? If is there a solution to this within Indian country? For example, Indian country's had a lot of assets flow through its hands through the casino industry. Should tribal nations be coming together and thinking differently than ever before with what to do with their cash? And should it be cash reserves? Should it be investment equity? Should it be something else that they're doing now from kind of the free spending years when every year there was more money? The last 2 years there's been a lot of cuts on reservations because of the recession. We're headed into the same boat. What would your advice be to tribal chairmen and tribal people on reservations?
I think you said the key word, and it's cash. In a deflationary environment, and that's all contraction is, and the government shrinking. In a deflationary environment, cash is king. Everything else pales. Commodities, stock market, all of that is nothing. But cash is what matters. So tribes that will come through this are the ones that protect their cash, and they protect it as well as they can. As assets start to get worth less and less, those with cash can buy them for a fraction of the cost.
Well, and let's ask this dumb question. 200 years ago, trade and commerce amongst native tribes was so extensive that food from the West Coast was being traded for food from the Great Lakes area. Is there a time frame or a possibility that we may be going back to some kind of a society that uses that for some kinds of a basis of its currency rather than the dollar?
I sure would like to see that. It doesn't have to be any kind of currency. It can just be straight trade. But absolutely, I think the more of that we can do, the better. The more we can stay outside of the system. I think we're going to have to depend less and less on the U.S. government for everything from education. We may be okay in terms of health funding, but beyond that, I think it's going to be pretty tough. Several bills in Congress pretty much eliminate the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. But in this environment, who knows?
Is the Bureau of Indian Affairs the only department with Interior that could be slated for its extinction?
No, I'm sorry to say. They're looking at many agencies. There's a proposal that won't go very far, but it's in the House to eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency.
Mining and reclamation, EPA impacts tribes. Mining and reclamation impacts tribes. Right on down the line.
Mining, they would just turn over to the companies, and we can trust them, right?
They made, mining companies, energy companies, they made some of the safest nuclear reactors in Japan. The result is that people in Japan don't have to suffer from their natural disasters.
Right.
Mark, it's good talking to you. Let's talk to you again soon. We want to follow this budget process and the super committee. Tomorrow in Wisconsin, we have recall elections against many people who supported the Tea Party governor in the state of Wisconsin. People are saying it may be a message about what the next general election is going to say to the world.
I'm watching.
Talk to you later.
Okay.
And that is going to be the latest roundup of news from Indian Country. On this edition of the Native News Update, we say miigwech for joining with us and come back again soon.